I've shared this story with some of you before about the very first patient I had when I was working in a mental hospital. And this patient was a young African-American woman who was suffering under a delusion. She thought she was Jesus. She really thought she was Jesus. There was one time in a session where I said, if Jesus were here, just like that, I am here. Christ is risen. It was right there. Well, the good people who worked out the psychiatric diagnoses, well, they thought that she was suffering under a delusion. But the more I worked with her, I realized there was a spiritual problem here as well. As I worked with her, I came to understand the root of that delusion. She saw in Jesus a figure of suffering. The people always did bad things to Jesus. They beat him. They spit on him. You can hear where this was coming from. This was her experience. Her experience was purely suffering. And in that suffering, she met Jesus in an overpowering way. And the spiritual diagnosis was, she's Mary outside the tomb before Jesus says to her, Mary, and full recognition takes place. She's caught so much in her suffering that the stone to her tomb has just been pushed aside a tiny bit, enough to let out a soothing presence of Jesus to help her come to terms with all the suffering and bitterness that she had experienced. There's a story in there for me and for all of us. And that story is, how far have I rolled the tomb, the stone away from the tomb? How far have you rolled that stone away? And do you dare roll it any further than it is? Well, how do you roll stones anyway? I think that the good fathers of the white-robed monks of St. Benedict have some good advice for us. They said, how do we come to the realization of God ourselves? In answer to this question, Catholicism is one with Zen and extolling the selfless life. By selfless, we do not mean that we deny in any way our created ego. See, there we go. We do have a created ego. And that's where a lot of our issues and problems begin to arise. We do not deny in any way our created ego. We refer to selfless in the sense of an attitude that we engender within our unconditional surrender to God, the ultimate self. Our unconditional surrender to God, the ultimate self. And, okay, the ego. Oh, the ego's a bad thing, right? No, the ego's not a bad thing. The ego is our user interface. That's how we deal with the world. If we get rid of the ego, we're going to do this. You know, we're going to become the Microsoft blue screen of death all over the world. Can't do that. No, we need the ego. Instead, we accept our self-created ego for just what it is. Our self-created ego. And we turn it into a servant of that ultimate self, the Christ present in us. Now, here he goes from preaching to meddling for professional holy people without being bound up in analytical thinking or reflecting on Jesus or his qualities. See, you know, oh, I'm going to study Jesus. Did he really walk on water? Did he do that? You know, that's a good dodge. And they say, no, don't do that. Withdraw those projections. And we do that. We become like little children. We let the life of Jesus rise up in our hearts and divinize our whole personality. We realize that until we become one with God, we cannot be one with ourselves. Our inner desires, hopes, fears, and emotions, we create to inflate our conscious ego. As we yield more and more to our true self, the truest self of all, we awaken. I live, not I, but Christ lives in me. Now, here's the real delusion. I recognized in this patient that the tomb was slightly open. That for her, the path to health was having the time to sit with someone and allow Christ to fully rise in her and divinize her whole personality, bring her to a place of redemption, a place where she can be able to accept herself in the midst of all the brokenness, in the midst of all the hatred and anger that she had been experiencing in her life. But you want to know what really happened? We pumped her full of neuroleptics, got her to the point where, no, I'm not Jesus, and we kicked her out the door. Now, who's deluded? Who's deluded? Hopefully, Christ did rise in that young woman, and she found salvation and wholeness in life. I don't know. That was the only time I saw her. But the question remains for you and me. How far are we going to roll that stone? How far? Are you Christ? Are you Christ? Are you Christ? Are you? Look like it. Are you Christ? Are you Christ? Are you Christ? Are you Christ? Back there in the back. Christ? Are you Christ? See, that's what resurrection is. Resurrection is watching that stone spin away and Christ rising in you and me, divinizing our whole personalities so we can go out into that world that does things like kick poor broken people out into the street, spends trillions of dollars on machines of war that produce nothing but death, that forgets the poor and those who are hurting. We can go out into that world with a different message. We can go out there with the message of God's love and redemption for all. Are you Christ? Are you Christ? Then rise.